أولاً صباح الخير جميعاً. بس أنا بدي إياكم تسمحوا لي لأنه هحكي لكم بالإنجليزي والعرض رح يكون بالإنجليزي إذا تسمحوا لي طبعاً. اليوم we want to talk new work patterns and how they affect the future of human resources. Two topics. First, when we look at what are new work patterns? Very simple. What is the new model of work? How is work done? When is work done? Where is work done? We're going to cover these throughout 10 different points that we'll go through together. The first thing we want to look at is work patterns over time. And we see that there's been 4 phases, let us say, recent phases, of work patterns. We've moved from our company worker, full-time, word processing, pen and paper, mechanical work if you're on the manufacturing line, let us say, 9 to 5, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., fixed hours typically, fixed days, part-time. Where? Physical locations, factories, offices, storefronts. Companies like Ford, for example, large accountancy firms. Your traditional way of looking at work. We shift, 1990s, 2000s, to the anywhere worker. Much more in terms of outsourcing, global professionals, much more international travel. You have how of the work is starting to change. You've got more international communications, email, internet's on the rise. You've got when is starting to shift. When companies operate in multiple locations, you have multi-time zone type of work. More rise in terms of regional HQs, setups, regional offices. Apple, for example, during this time, was restructuring its supply chains, pushing lots of offices and lots of production processes to China. Obviously necessitated new ways of work for Apple. Travel, communications internationally, different modes of work in terms of setting up regional HQs. The same for IBM, which eventually shifted a huge amount of its support services, its HR, to different international offices outside of HQ. We shift again, 2010s, to the anytime worker. So here you look at gig, temporary, hybrid workers. Lots more in terms of the rise of platform work, different remote working tools. And then you get lots of things like flexible hours, more in terms of deliverable-based. You get paid if you complete a task, like on TaskRabbit, for example, or Upwork. You get remote-ready and shared working spaces as well. Here, of course, there's Uber, but there's also things like the Amazon Mechanical Turk, which was one of the first ways that you could actually issue a project and have people bid on explicit parts of work. Now you've got the rise of the digital worker. Digital, looking as we talked about before, some of the AI, what types of autonomous roles. You've got a how that's being changed. Collaboration platforms, Office 365, unification across different work tools. You've got much more in terms of global teams, 24/7 continuity of work, and you have borderless, more homework. COVID was a huge shift in terms of that. 5%, at least within the US, of companies and people reported working remotely, to 25% post-COVID. You've shared platforms which are driving a lot of the work and how work is allocated and given. Some companies like Duolingo, for example, which have introduced AI and actually restructured their entire language learning program, or Shopify, which has been pushed into a platform-first support. Company, anywhere, anytime, and now digital. Big question, why is this happening? And why is it important so we can start to see what will come? 4 big shifts. I'm an economist by training, so I like the economic structural shifts. We've got a huge portion of the economy which shifts to services. Services, office work, professional work, 35%, 1994, 49%. Big decreases in agriculture, a little bit of rise in manufacturing. Obviously, much easier to have different modes of work if you're working in an office. 2, companies are growing global. Lots more participation within global value chains, multi-country production processes. 35% of GVCs as a share of global trade or global exports to 48%. Internationalization of work. The third, technology leaps. So structurally, the economy is changing, and now we've got the tools to support it. Average number of devices or connections on the internet per person on a global basis, 2.4 in 2018 to over 3.5 in 2023. And obviously, those are concentrated and structured as well in terms of people having multiple devices, multiple points of connectivity. And then finally, we have a behavioral shift. We have more people who prefer fewer days of work or more concentrated hours, 64% according to a Manpower study globally. Start times, the ability to have flexi hours when you can start, 45%. Where to work, 35%. It's the same with companies though. Companies prefer the flexibility, the start times to change, to have the ability to operate within shifts. So we have these 4 different drivers of our new work patterns. Now you may say to me, but of course there's still company work. Of course there's still people that work 9 to 5. Of course that there are people, for example, that are working in a gig economy and maybe have other jobs. No question. One thing we see is that as we shift through the phases, it doesn't mean that one phase is completely wiped out. Of course not. What we're seeing is that they're starting to build on each other. So we have some people who are still working as a company worker. We have some people as well moving towards anywhere worker, some people as well moving towards anytime worker, and now we have people working as a digital worker. And we see that as we've increased and added on our work patterns, is they've had a tendency to increase 2 things. So one, the flexibility. Flexibility meaning where and when you work. You can work more remotely if you're a digital worker. You typically have more time or choice in terms of your hours as you move up the scale from company worker to digital worker. Second is the increase in autonomy, meaning this: the worker control to how to perform work and the relationship with the company. Typically, as you go up the scale, you shift from am I working hours and I'm getting paid for hours, to am I producing outputs that I'm getting paid for. The second is typically the contractual structure with your employer changes. Company worker, typically fixed-term contracts, full-term employment, benefits. Anywhere, anytime worker, and to a lesser extent, digital worker, you get more flexible contract structures. You get less, particularly in case of anytime worker, fixed obligations from the company. So we see that as we changed and moved through our phases of work, we've had corresponding increases in autonomy and our flexibility. Our third point. The fourth is when we start to look at sectors, and we look at Dubai. So looking at the economic sectors, from education, construction, real estate, all the way up to ICT, is we see that our modes of work don't map exactly onto sectors. There are blurry lines between these modes. Meaning this, your education, typically still fixed. School times, contract structures, working in set hours. There's exceptions, tutoring, a whole host of different ones, but typically more on the company worker side. The same in some of the others, real estate, for example, public administration in terms of the government work, typically more on the company worker side. As we move our way up, though, we start to see different types of forms of work being done. As we hit more service type of work, manufacturing work as next, as you have some levels of contracted work, some levels of full-time employment, some levels where companies are shifting work in these regards overseas and having multiple sourcing companies associated with it. As you move further up, you start to hit more anytime work. Things in terms of accommodation, food service activities, where of course you have service workers, of course you have retail, but you're starting to have more things, whether it be in terms of Airbnb, whether it be in terms of delivery services, which are relying much more on gig economy platform. As we move up the scale, we start to see more introductions of digital work, or what we call our digital worker, where we're seeing much more flexible hours, particularly ICT, a bit in finance, and a bit in terms of professional, scientific, and technical activities, much more in terms of new modes of work, new modes of organizing work as well, whether it be in terms of contractual structures, one piece, second in terms of the types of platforms that are being used in terms of work, or third in terms of location work, where you're seeing more and more rise of remote work and hybrid work and other models. So we see that out of our total, about 4 million plus in terms of Dubai, if you add our commuters in, is we've got a varying split among the activities or the types of work. But we see that the lines are blurry. If we start to look at what are job vacancies actually starting to say. So this is something we do at our company, and we look at the future of work. We look at job vacancies, located UAE, Dubai, start to classify them by, of course, in terms of what types of sector that they are, and then on the y-axis here, the type of occupation. So we can have some sort of idea as to what companies are looking to hire to have a bit more of a future-based focus. And we see from the UAE and job vacancies since 2020, and there's about 300,000 plus of the different ones that we've looked at, is that a lot of them, so like real estate activities, information and communication, a bit administrative food services, professional scientific and technical activities, tend to be a little bit more along the new ways of work. If we look at the occupations, this is business professionals, ICT professionals, for example, a bit in terms of management, as they typically as well are a bit more in terms of the higher skilled. So as well, we can start to see that when we even look at hiring practices, is there's a bit more of a push towards these jobs and these sectors where there could be a bit more of a new work model itself. Now, when we look at the trends, and we talk about we're at digital phase right now, what may shape the future labor market? 4 main trends we look at. So one, split labor market. We're seeing bigger demands from companies themselves, engineering, science, technology, and less in terms of office support. If we look at generative AI, which we've talked about before, we see when we look at hours, the potential 30% could be automated. Other big points are distraction work. This idea that as we've increased our technologies and different platforms, it's actually preventing us from going into deep work, from our constant emails, from the telephone communications, whatever it may be. So we know that technology both has the opportunity to automate a lot of our tasks, to make us more productive, but depending on how we use it, potentially less productive. A third block, getting into the behavioral, is a demand for always-on talent. Meaning this, that as we've increased our connectivity, and as we become more flexible in terms of our work, is that there's an expectation for certain jobs to be always on, to be always responsive. Of course, that can benefit productivity, it can benefit output, but also there are challenges. Work-life balance, the ability or the potential for burnout. The fourth block, time for demands, time sovereignty and flexibility. So this idea as well, how can I, as a worker, choose my own location to work, hours to work, and to still be responsive to the company needs? So we see structural labor shifts, technology, and then behavioral blocks to shape the future. there's a question about what that future will look like. So if we look until 2030, 4 possible scenarios, at least that I can see. On one hand, on the y-axis, you've got technology penetration or digital penetration. Are we going to have extremely high penetration, meaning this, is that we're shifting completely towards digital. We've introduced digital processes, we've completely digitized our operations within companies. We've introduced different models of AI, whether it be AI agents, whether it be different algorithmic ways of looking at work at a very high level. We have low technology penetration where maybe it doesn't quite work out that way, as we still have GPT, for example, as our browser that we can look at, but it hasn't really restructured our workflows. On the x-axis, where we look here, looking at the ability of employees to benefit from those technology changes or to use those technology changes for their benefit. On one hand, they're empowered. They have the skills. They're able to take advantage of all the different digital and technological tools at their disposal, and companies push them to do that. On the other hand, workers don't all have those types of tools, don't have the capabilities to adapt them. There are workers, for example, who may be left behind. So when we look at the combination, as we start to see some distinct scenarios which have distinct implications for HR. On the high technology side, with empowered workers, workers' paradise. Productivity gains, company is benefiting, and critically workers are benefiting. Humans and machine working hand in hand, flexible labor market, workers have many different opportunities, they can change jobs, they can shift. For HR, what will this mean? Probably strong planning, workforce planning, recruitment planning, understanding where to fill those gaps and fill them quickly. And to see if that should be filled with a human or digital tool. Let's say our workers are empowered, but we have low technology penetration, talent competition. You've got skilled workers who remain at a premium. The idea about a 10x developer where one developer is 10 times more productive than another is still the case, because not all technology gains have been given to others. But you have lots of workers with many skill sets. Manual work may still somewhat be important. We're here, recruit, retain, developing those critical career, looking at career journeys and supporting them is critical. How we can get workers to upgrade skills and have stronger workforce planning and continuity is also a critical piece. If we look at the other side, where we've got workers who may not all be able to benefit from the technology, may not all be able to benefit from new digital tools or AI, as we start to see a dual labor market, where we've got digital stars commanding benefits alongside a huge portion of work which may be contracted, temporary, and there you've got a different form of recruitment. How do we keep and retain our stars? How can we have personalized potential career journeys for them? How can we have key account managers, for example, to support them? How can we look at the same time to build up other work forces or to identify tasks which could be digitalized and looking to a different means of contracting temporary workers? Worker dystopia, low technology penetration, disempowered workers, for example. What does that mean? Big problems or challenges for businesses, limited investments in workers. You've got then potentially lots of management oversight, try to squeeze efficiency gains out of workers, tracking keystrokes, physical location, mandates. You've got HR, which is then pushed more towards value for money. How can we make the most out of the types of workers that we have? How can we get the most out of them? Obviously, within these different scenarios, we much prefer paradise, talent competition. How can we push into some of these directions, if you will? And it's critical that HR has a strong role to play in this, both in terms of upskilling talent, identifying those types of jobs, and then pushing them through career journeys. That requires a new look, let us say, at HR, or maybe new perspectives as how we can look at HR and HR departments. Along a strategy, model of HR, what we care about and track via KPIs, and even our systems themselves. Part of it is moving from a process-based to a strategic-based HR. From a strategy side, moving from aware how work happens, are we concerned with this, when, to what type and how work is actually executed. So understanding very intimately how business processes are and whether some of those processes can be digitalized, will be digitalized, and if they are, how can workers benefit from that? The second block in terms of model, moving from, we call it transaction-based, where we're pushing through transactions, payroll, compensation, what have you, still critical, no question in terms of that, but more pushing towards an advisory role. How HR can advise and drive much more of the business as opposed to being the recipient of business. Understanding that strategic talent that's needed by the company, pushing it forward and pushing it into places within the firm where the firm and the talent can benefit. KPIs, moving as well from inputs, which of course need to be tracked, headcount, hours worked, task completion, static skills metrics, much more towards results-based. How we can look at outcomes, for example, that we want to track, outputs of employees, and critically productivity as well in terms of staff. How we can start to measure in terms of our staff contributing to our organizational objectives, obviously within the government, fulfillment of our entity objectives, within Dubai government objectives, within the UAE objectives. Then systems. Right now, enterprise resource planning, big one. HR module integrated within it, to much more integrated systems themselves within HR. So we can start to track productivity, for example, outputs, workers, a long time, and to be able to say how we can actually see the impacts of automating certain tasks, where employees can actually contribute more strategically, let us say, to the company itself. So it's a shift in terms of how HR can be looked at. There are things, of course, even within the government that we look at, how to increase more flexibility or structural shifts within workers. And we talk a lot about digital work and flexible work. Could be in terms of entrepreneurship, self-employment, looking at trade license fees and removals of them for Emiratis, for example. Non-Emirati, I think it's 7,000 dirham. How can we define explicitly what self-employed is? Mohri has actually a self-employment work permit itself, but in terms of targeting self-employed actually for additional support. Flexibility, restructuring quotas, for example, allowing more firms to hire more people, depending on, moving away from office-based quota work, and saying you only have X number of employees per X square meters, and saying we can double it, increase it even further, for example, to encourage more remote work. Ideas about non-compete. One of the big pushes, at least within the US, has been to strike down non-compete clauses and to actually encourage even more labor worker flexibility in certain circumstances. Integrating new metrics, productivity monitoring, for example, output and outcome-based measurements, how we can look to introduce those further across all levels of work within governments. The private sector typically does it in terms of creating cost centers and measuring revenue per employees. Government obviously needs a different metric. Flexible working hours, so obviously we're experimenting them within Dubai. How we can look to measure them, monitor them, and then to look to adapt them and roll them out, for example, across, as well within the UAE. A critical component supporting everywhere work, but how to maintain the human connection. So one thing that we've seen is a backlash against remote work in some locations. So for example, within the US, Jamie Dimon, head of JP Morgan, and the big push to say workers are not productive outside of offices. We want to bring them, back. You've got others, the head of Slack basically said, no, of course not, is that we can do it if we have proper tools, if we have proper management, and we have proper, guidelines to do it. If that's the case, there still needs to be some maintenance of the human connection in some shape or form, to have locations, to have places to connect, because different types of work can be done more effectively in different settings. Whereas writing a document, for example, could be more effective at home, brainstorming, idea generation, what have you, can be done as well, and maybe more effectively in person. So the idea here is to provide a bit of a snapshot as to what are these work patterns, where are we going, and what are different ways that HR departments can respond to them. These are my 10 points. If any questions, please let me know.